I do something very, very simple. And I ask 5 people in the organization and I say, explain to me what the company does. And if it is not consistent, I know there's a messaging problem.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Revenue Problem Solvers podcast, which is built for revenue leaders who aren't afraid to say or ask for help when they're stuck and they need a real answer. I'm Carl Ortmans, and on today's episode, we're going to unpack this very big topic of this world called marketing. Today's podcast is sponsored by the fantastic team at Virtual Causeway. Imagine your sales team spending less time chasing and more time closing because your buyers already know your name before that first call. Well, that's exactly what Virtual Causeway does. They help B2B companies get found earlier in the buying process by the right people through the right channels that actually influence decisions today. Well, the result? It's fewer cold calls, better conversations, and pipeline that moves faster. You can learn more about them at virtualcauseway.com, and don't forget to mention the show for a special rate. All right. Most B2B companies treat messaging like a copyright problem. They keep rewriting the headline, they're swapping the adjectives, they're testing subject lines. Now, my guest today would tell you that's not where the work is. The work is actually upstream. My guest today is Nima Chadha, CMO at Venti Group, one of North America's leading product marketing agencies, working with companies like SAP, Adobe, Okta, and even Palo Alto Networks. Now, here's a fun fact about Nima. She started in sales, not in marketing. And that matters because she's seen broken messaging from the side of the table where it actually has to land with a rep in front of a prospect who can't explain what the product does or why it's different. From there, she went on to found Offload Marketing. It's her own fractional CMO practice, helping early to mid-stage B2B tech companies build positioning from scratch. And then she brought that operator lens as the CMO at Venti, where she's now leading messaging and go-to-market engagements for more than 25 companies. And in my view, this is what makes her the right person to talk to about this topic, is because she's not approaching messaging as a brand exercise. She's approaching it as a revenue problem. Nima, welcome to the Revenue Problem Solvers podcast, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. That intro made me feel all warm and fuzzy. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Job one done. Make everybody feel comfortable. I've been looking forward to this, and maybe a quick shout out to our good friend Gary Amaral, who made the introduction to us. And Gary was, I think, my second or third guest on the podcast, and we're coming sort of full circle now with talking about a different aspect of marketing. So really appreciate you, Gary.
Likewise, Gary connects good people to good people, so I appreciate Gary.
We should just call him the connector. Maybe we stop calling him Gary, just the connector.
Just rename him, rebrand him.
That's right. To kick us off, Nima, could you share with the audience a little bit of context to your world? What industries or verticals do you work in? What are the selling motions? What size companies do you work with?
Yeah, so like you said in the beginning, I have 2 lenses here, which is a unique perspective, I always like to say. So I'm CMO at Venti Group, which is the more enterprise end of things, right? Working with the SAPs of the world, the larger organizations that are looking at product marketing as a whole. And then I have my own consultancy, which is Offload Marketing, in which I work with sort of small to mid-sized businesses, typically PE, VC backed, not really budgeted to have a full-time CMO and C-level on deck, but looking for that edge that's going to get them to that next $10 million in revenue. So I get this unique perspective, I would say, on both sides, which are the industry and the sizes of companies that are on the up and up of the larger orgs of the world, and then the people that are sort of the scale-ups, more than the startups, that are figuring it out live, and that big B2B SaaS saying of we are changing the engine on the plane while we're flying it is really true.
It happens more than we think, but it is also sort of the way that most companies have been built, right? You get an idea, you bring it to market, and then it's like, oh, now you get more people or more something and more. And it's like, you have to change something. Well, we've already taken off. Like, we've got to keep this thing going. So bubble gum and duct tape, or as I like how the GTMOS partners talk about it. They build everything in scaffolding first before they build something in sort of concrete or anything else, because you're going to have to, you build it, you're going to move it and change it and do something else, because it's building that structure. So I like that.
Absolutely. If you're not doing that first, we are not doing it right.
Yeah. Test, iterate, and then continue to move. So
100%.
yeah, that's awesome. So how we got to the topic of today is I asked Nima, just like I ask everybody, hey, what's a successful revenue initiative you've ever led, or an existing challenge that you've either solved or currently trying to solve? And we did not take long to get to the topic and say, look, we've got to talk about messaging and positioning, because it really is a gap that's a constant conversation within revenue leadership rooms that I've been part of. And even talking with others, it's something that's constantly bringing up and being brought up. So if we were to start at this point, and I ask you this, when you're brought into a company to work on messaging, what does broken actually look like? And what are the symptoms that you see the most often with companies?
You know what? I love this question because I think people listening are going to think it's going to be a complicated answer of this is what I need to check to see if my messaging is broken. But I do something very, very simple. And I ask 5 people in the organization and I say, explain to me what the company does. And if it is not consistent, I know there's a messaging problem. And the reason I say that is because everyone might have their own variation. And it's important to have your own spin on how you talk about where you work, what your company does, who you do it for. But if it's not built on the same pillars, if it's not generally the same narrative, there's a messaging problem. And that's typically where we start. When I'm talking to a CEO, talking to a CMO, a lot of the time there's conviction, as there should be, that we did this entire messaging framework exercise. We know what we're doing, and therefore our messaging is strong. But then you ask somebody else that's not in marketing, and that's where you find the sort of broken telephone there. There's an iteration that's existed that has transformed what might have been the foundational marketing message that marketing once spit out, and now messaging is broken. So really quick and easy, ask 5 people in your organization today, no matter the size. I don't care if you're, tens and thousands of people or you are a 10-person org, ask 5 people in the company, what do we do? Who do we do it for? And see if there are some foundational sort of elements or narratives that still exist across the board. And if it's inconsistent, something there is broken.
I really like how you call that out, because I think my experience with this is it's sort of a view of your lens, right? And I think maybe this is where you're getting to, but the lens of, if I'm a sales rep, as an example, on the front lines, and I work in large public sector, well, I might have a view. Or if I'm an SMB rep in, let's call it food and beverage, I might look at it a little bit different, because I'm talking specifically to audiences that I personally am part of, but we kind of lose that bigger topic. So I think there's a question in here, and maybe I'll give a little bit of context, and then I'll ask you the question, because this is where my mind is racing. Is the same issue, regardless of the company and the size, that you have to see all the time? And so my underlying question, or sort of context to that, is what I've seen in my experience is, if you join and you're building the airplane while it's flying, well, you're a part of early days and you have different context. When you join later on, maybe you're employee 100 or 150, well, now things are a little bit more fleshed out and you don't have that same context. Is there an aspect of when I joined that dictates that outcome or that answer?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I would say when you join and the size of the company makes a difference, because what once was the messaging might not always be the messaging. And that's what I think we have to take note of. As the company grows, I've been in situations where I was employee number 10 and the company grew to over 200. And in that instance, messaging was iterative, right? We had to reevaluate our stance and who we were for every quarter. And a lot of the time it was a validation exercise. A lot of the time nothing changed. In other instances, a lot changed. And that could have been a result of, we had more products to offer. We were offering more services. As you enter new markets, as you grow in size, as your buyer might change from you might have been marketing to your users and not your buyers, your positioning, which I know we'll talk about a little bit more, changes. And if we're not quarterly evaluating this on a regular basis, we're kind of getting stuck in the past. So short answer to your question is yes, right? We should change what we're doing if you are employee number 10 versus employee number 100, but there needs to still be the same level of attention to it. It's not just, let's take a look at this positioning or messaging house framework that we did in 2002 and update the copy and update the homepage on our site, and there we go. There's a lot more that goes into it, and it's a full-on exercise.
Yeah. Going back to what you said is you ask 5 people in the org, and it sounds like this is how you start. When you get that information, what do you do with it?
It's a good question. So I just had this happen 2 weeks ago with a CEO, and it was a co-CEO situation. I asked them both how they would describe their company, and they both led with features, and they told me about the product, and they didn't lead with benefits or pain points or outcomes. It was all feature led. And I said, at the end of this engagement, I'm going to ask you again, and I want you to remember what your differentiator is. And I do this because I want the owners or the CMOs or whoever I'm talking to realize that your messaging isn't a true message if all you're doing is describing your product. And I say, if I can put a competitor's name in front of everything you just said, it's not good enough. And I'll let that kind of sit for a second, because a lot of the time, people will say, well, there's like a lot of bread companies out there, and everyone says they're the same thing. Like we're made with this, with whole grains and what have you. But we really have to own a corner of the room. And if you're not owning a corner of the room, you're just sounding like everybody else, and you get lost in a bunch of noise.
Okay, so you said a couple things that I really want to dig into and ask you more about. But the one that comes to mind is April Dunsford. If you know April, she wrote the sales pitch, and she's written her first book was obviously awesome. But in her second book, what I loved is she talked about what's your toilet. I keep going back to what's your toilet story, right? And because you walk into any of your big box stores, or you're going to go buy a toilet. Well, technically, they all do the exact same thing.
Absolutely.
Things go in, things go out, right? It's more of like, which one do you pick and how do you know? And I really I go back to that when I talk with others, is like, okay, what's your toilet story? Because you could put something, whatever the market is. And I like you said, like the messaging isn't a true message. So what's your toilet story? How is it differentiated? And if they do go, because I did write down ahead of time as you're going, it was, well, is it a feature dump or is it a value? Because I think that's where people get stuck. So in that, let's talk a little more about, what do you mean by owning the corner of the room?
Yeah. So I like to use an analogy, and shout out to April Dunford. I love that as well. That analogy is golden. So everyone should be thinking, and what's your story with the toilet? But I would say owning your corner of the room is, I like to use the analogy of, let's say you got a home inspection done, right? And someone came in and told you A, B, and C needs to get done in your house, your windows, your roof, and you need a general paint job across the house. Are you going to hire a general contractor to change your windows, paint your house, and do your roof? The answer is probably no. You're going to find a roofing company. You're going to find a window company. You're going to find someone that's good at painting. They have corners of the room. This is what we do, and this is what we do well. If somebody is going to hire a GC in that situation, they're probably not your audience, right? They're not looking for that value that you're offering. And I say this corner of the room is really important, because we're not trying to fix someone's entire house. And I'll use a Venti Group as an example. A Venti Group is a product marketing agency, right? We work with product marketers. We work with the CMOs, the senior directors of product marketing. We're not trying to reinvent your brand here. We are owning a corner of the room when it comes to product marketing. We're not trying to be everything for everyone. We are trying to be this one thing for this group that really, really needs it. And I think something I say often is that the goal really isn't to be known by everyone. It's to be obvious to the right people. And I say that across an engagement or to people I'm speaking with, because I think a lot of the time if it's demand is down, or, we're trying to, as marketers, we're trying to drive revenue all the time, we become everything to everyone at some point. We say, well, let's see what we can do. Let's pull this lever and pull that lever. But take that time to paint the shop. and let's stay in our corner of the room and really, really double down on what's working.
Does this come into alignment with like sort of a notion of chasing shiny things? And what I mean by that is like when you're especially in that early days, like using that scaffolding. Well, we're going to try to figure it. We're in the position of we're going to try to figure it out, and we're going to look at validation. Like, are we in the validation aspect, or the problem market fit? Because you're trying to you have a problem, you're trying to solve it. So you're in that problem market fit phase. And what can happen, and I see this regularly, is that I'm going to chase shiny things. I'm going to go over there. I'm going to go over there. I'm going to go there. And I tie a couple of conversations. Even Dan Wardle was on the podcast, and we talked about total addressable market. And even actually Jay Bear, he was on as well. And we talked about total addressable market and defining it. It is one of the traps. I'll ask it this way: is it a trap for founders specifically, to really not niche down, or maybe, like you say, own the corner of the room?
It's a good question. And I think, to address the shiny object, I've heard this in a few ways. I don't know if you've heard of Alex Ramosi. He says this quite a bit as well. He calls it the girl in the red dress theory, but it's the same thing, right? Don't get distracted by the girl in the red dress. Don't chase the shiny object. And it happens oftentimes, I would say, on the smaller scale, smaller side businesses, which are PE VC backed, or a CEO goes to Silicon Valley, sees this new thing that's trending, or their VC has sent them something on AI doing A, B, and C, or company in their portfolio is doing A, B, and C, and we get distracted by that shiny object. So it is really important to stay laser focused when that happens. By all means, test and test and test, but know what you're testing and test it for a finite period of time, and make sure you're staying course of what is your bread and butter. And I think that's where sometimes the shiny objects can distract us a little bit too much. It's not a bad thing to try things out, test them, measure to see if they're working, but don't let that deviate from your core work that you are doing in the niche that you are serving.
I like how you called this out, and it's a topic I think we've talked about it a few different times on this one. The podcast is, it's good to go and try something else, but use it as a test. Make sure that you have the right people doing the test as well, because if you're in the sales side, you don't want to take some people out of the sales seat that are doing really well in a vertical to go whole into something else, or maybe you give them an opportunity to try it, or you go with that test. And that I start with a hypothesis, and I kind of like how you said this is like I'm going to run a hypothesis and testing and see what happens, which I really like. And how do we get to where you're talking about the testing? So you got those 5 people, you've got through it, you get an insight, you say, you know what, there's some overlaps on these things, but these are so far out. What do you do with the teams, or how do you work with them to say, all right, this is actually your corner of the room, this other stuff is just the noise, and here's how we need to go? Like, what's that? Do you have a process, or do you have a system? How do you think through this?
It would honestly be exactly what your gut is probably telling you to say right now, and it's look at the numbers. Right. Let's remember that everything needs to drive revenue. It comes down to the bottom line. It's really nice to chase those shiny objects and say, let me do this. But what did it do at the end of the day? What's the opportunity cost here of you, your team members, whoever else was spending the time on it, to go and do whatever it is that they were testing that's taking away from their day-to-day that is actually hitting the bottom line? And maybe there's a runway there, right? Maybe there's hey, this is something that needs our full attention for it to become a long-term gain in 6 months. So it comes down to the numbers is the short answer to that question of, let's not forget why we're here, what we're doing, what needs to happen at the end of the day. When it's things around thought leadership, let's build a longer runway. Let's come up with, how long that needs to be. If it's a 6-month initiative test, if that's a bit longer, and then let's resource accordingly, right? Let's use an existing resource that has freed up time. Let's spend a chunk of change when we can afford to do that on that test subject, but always come back to the numbers.
What I think I hear you say, and I could be wrong, is this conversation between brand and demand.
I like it.
Is that sort of what you're leaning to what does your brand say to create demand, or what do you have enough demand for your brand? Or I don't know if you look at it that way from a revenue of demand or the money, and then where's your brand? Because as I've heard many times, oh, Carl, branding is so hard.
Mhm.
I agree 100%. It's hard, and even harder is like the pricing, and once you get to that part, etc. But that branding and demand conversation sort of like leans me to ask you where we are here is, do you start for the demand and say, well, this is where we need to lean the brand? Do you look at the brand and say, well, the demand is actually over there? Or am I way off?
You're not way off. I think that's a constant battle. I think, and I love these conversations because it jumps us around different places of all the challenges people are facing. I think it's a constant battle people go through. I think CEOs in general will say, well, I have a brand team or I have a demand team, and they err towards the side of demand needs all my investment because it's driving pipeline. Brand is harder to quantify. Brand is harder to say, well, yes, let's go and do this thought leadership initiative that I think is going to drive us some revenue, but how do I draw that attribution at the end of the day? So I think there's always a battle between brand and demand. I think what I'm more so saying when it comes to positioning and demand gen here is that test those things again, still focus on your bottom line, but don't be afraid to test. Don't test for too long. Don't invest down a rabbit hole where you're not seeing the gains. So even when we are testing, let's just set parameters. And that's actually an area that I think we could all do better as marketers. Just say, what are my parameters here if I do want to go and test something that's more on the brand side of things versus demand? And again, not everything from a brand side needs to have a hot number to it, but it needs to show a pathway. And let's develop what that pathway is. So did this podcast that we started and invested $100,000 into, did it create 100 contacts that could potentially one day be customers of what we're offering? And thinking in that lens, did it create a network? Did it open a door that was closed previously? Let's try to think about our measurements in that realm if we can't tie an exact number to it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It also goes, it makes me think of, look, we're gonna use, I've heard CMOs say, I'm gonna use 30% of my budget. That, you know what, you're not gonna touch this. I'm going to do a lot of experiments, but you know what, this 30%, we're gonna try stuff we're not expecting, and because we want to see and we want to push and we're gonna try different things. So don't expect a return for this 30%, but the other 70%, we're fully locked in. Is that a best practice? Like, do you suggest that, or how do you look at trying to make sure you're testing and iterating while not deviating too far from the cores that we're talking about?
So if I put my CEO hat on, my short answer is yes, that could work as long as demand is not suffering. Right. But if I'm getting told, hey, 30% of my budget's being tested while the 70% is not hitting our targets, we already know what the answer there is going to be. So right. I think that there's a fine balance that can exist. I think if you're not testing as a marketer today, you're not doing something correctly, to be honest. You need to be testing, especially in the wake of AI. I know we're probably AI fatigued at this point with everybody talking about it, writing about it, and all the things, but it's a true fact. If we're not testing, especially with things like AI, there's new tools coming to market. It is not, I talked about this recently. It's not man versus tools. It is man with tools. Let's think about it with that lens. And if we are not using the tools or testing the tools that are at our disposal, we're not going to be growing as marketers or as a marketing department. So I think there is something to be said about using a subset of your budget, providing the other part of your budget is performing in the way that it needs to perform as well.
Yeah. John Barrow said it probably the best that I've heard, and I really like his analogy, was if you're a Marvel Comics fan and you liked the Marvel movies, he said Iron Man's suit was just Iron Man. Mm-hmm. It wasn't, Iron Man didn't actually become Iron Man until Jarvis, and it was man and AI working together for a common outcome. And I really like that because I do believe there's human in the loop. And I totally also agree with you. There's changing happening so fast with AI, and it's like, because I think the common theme I hear from people is, did I do the right decision? Did I make the right decision? Because what else is next?
Yeah.
And that what else is next, that FOMO is so real in terms of the AI world. I do have AI written down as we're talking, but I want to come back to it. Is there an example you think about from as you've gone into it and you said, okay, I go through, I ask these 5 questions, I get the information. Now I start to make some changes. Do I implement right away? Like, what do you do once you have that, and how do you start to move it down the funnel, so to speak, across the orgs to say, here's the new path and the direction?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I wish there was like a master playbook to this that I could just hand over. But the short sort of pathway answer here is, so we have this conversation, we figure out, are there gaps? Are things broken? Is there repetition across the board? And if there isn't repetition, how do we get there? So a lot of the time that drives me into talking to customers. How are customers now talking about the product or the offering or the business? Other stakeholders in the business that we might not have spoken to. When it's available, we also talk to churned customers or lost opportunities. I want to know what happened in their perception of what the company did or does or offered that they might have spoken about in a different way. Sometimes it's just literally, I spend so much time listening to recordings, right? A lot of us are using, I always say we're in the era of it's a 1-to-1 person ratio and a 1-to-1 note taker ratio in calls now. And it's like everyone's bringing their lawyer to a call. It's everyone's bringing their AI note taker to a call these days. And listen to those call recordings of your sales team. Listen to the Gong recordings. Listen to whatever tool you're using and hear it from the voice of a prospect. And then listen to the same from a CS standpoint. Hear it from the voice of a customer. What are the parallels that we are drawing? And let's come up with common themes. The other thing I would do is take a look at the competitive landscape. Right. So a lot of the time there's almost always a quadrant that you can put yourself in that will make you look like you are leaning to the top right and you do have a corner of the room. Let's build that quadrant and let's just ingrain the narrative that we're trying to build. I did this at a company 10 years ago now, maybe. And we wanted, it was a safety compliance business, and we wanted them to be measuring participation score. And safety leaders that we had people saying, what is a participation score? I've never heard of that before. So we created content. We did a light research study with Stanford University's name on it because we worked with a person there and said, here's our Stanford University research study on safety participation scores and why this matters. And it was a brand new theme, but our corner of the room became, this company measures your safety participation. What's yours? So it created this question mark of, I don't know what mine is. I don't have a score on this. How do I score myself? Oh, I can only score myself with this company and the platform. And Stanford said that this is a benchmark that I should be in. Let me be in this club. And so, you build a narrative that allows you to take a corner of the room. And you do that by figuring out what people will resonate most with. So be that customers, prospects, potential prospects. There's just so many avenues to go through that if you can generalize a theme that is uncovering as you have those conversations, you're building foundation to what I would call your messaging framework. And that's where you then begin the testing. So we pitch it back. We talk to the CEOs, we talk to the CMOs, we pitch back the messaging framework. And I always say, you pitch it and you pause, pitch and pause. And you say, does it resonate? Tell me how that makes you feel. And then the best win, I always say, is when you hear it repeated back. When someone gives you this moment of silence kind of nod, and then they say it back to you. And it's just, yes, the repetition, the affirmation is happening in real time. And that's how you know you got messaging that's sticky.
Pitch and pause. Got that written down. It's awesome. Yeah. I really like that. And even how you said, now I maybe, when you said corner of the room, I had a vision. And then you said the magic quadrant. I'm like, oh, she's talking about like the quadrant and where are you in that quadrant and where's the room? Okay, those two now connect for me. And so going back to what you were just saying about now you roll it out and you hear people say it, and it takes, it takes on average 7 times for somebody to hear something before they actually like it, before it actually lands. So there's a potential elephant in the room question here, is because now that you have this new messaging, you talk to the CEOs, you talk to the leaders, and you go, cool, now we're going to roll it out. There's this group of people that are I don't want to say stuck in their ways, but they have a way of doing things and they are adapting it to where they are. And that's sales teams. And because they are in so many conversations, crazy, I know. How do you get that across the board and roll it out with the sales team then once you get that in? Because you have to, I'll say infiltrate. Is that the right way to say it? You have to infiltrate that new messaging across the organization and really get it deployed. So how do you go about deploying that and making sure it lands and it sticks across every department?
Yeah, I love this question because it is oftentimes I always hear, well, this is great. Thanks so much for doing this. Now what? Right. And that becomes the big sort of, what do I do with this great deck or this great messaging framework that's been created? And marketing is feeling like they're on top of the world because they get it, right? They have it in a nutshell. They can repeat it. They can tell everybody, but it means absolutely nothing if it is not educated throughout the organization. So this is going to be controversial because people are going to disagree, but everybody in the organization needs to know your messaging and positioning. I don't care if they're the receptionist at the front desk, if they are, answering support tickets. They should know who you are, what you do, who you're for, who you're not for, and everything that you stand for as a business. And we did this. This was pre-COVID. I worked with a company and we did this. We created a positioning guide, and it was part of the onboarding of any and every new employee. And we had poached, I remember, some salespeople from competing organizations. And I remember one of them distinctively told me, he said, "Who wrote this?" And I said, "Yeah, I did," because I was the head of marketing at the time. And he's like, "This is the biggest value that your competitor doesn't have." And he had come directly from a competitor and said, "The fact that you even have this document is just going to change the game." And it did change the game for that business. Later that business exited, sold, did a really great job. Everything was amazing. But the repetition, the affirmation, the training that was happening across every employee as they onboarded to the business was, here you have a positioning guide session with our head of marketing. And you might have been like, well, why do I do this? But we made it fun. We made it relevant to what they did. And we made it so that it wasn't a test. It wasn't something like you were part of an exam that you had to score. It wasn't just put on someone's desk. It was interactive. It was a conversation with every new employee. Yes, it was time consuming, but it was worth it because everybody was drinking the same Kool-Aid, and we had repetition, affirmation, and hand on my heart, if you asked 5 people in that organization, they would say the same thing.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. I like how you've done that. And from my sales enablement hat lens comes into play is like, yeah, this is exactly what needs to happen. Because if somebody calls and says, I'm looking for a company that does this, and they call the receptionist as the example, and the receptionist goes, "Oh yeah, that's not what we do. That's not us." Well, did you lose an opportunity? Maybe, but having that same consistent theme is great. Actually, going through boot camp at Salesforce, they're very big on that. Everybody knows exactly what they do so that no questions are left unturned. And so you effectively have, I don't mean to have the military themes here, but it's about like you have an army of people that are saying the exact same thing regardless of where you are. So when you, as the leader of that brand and positioning, aren't in the room, you're actually in the room without knowing you're in the room.
Absolutely. I always say, and this was younger in my career, I'd say if my parents asked me what I did for a living and I said the name of the company and they said, "Well, what do they do?" How would you answer that question? And ask yourself that. Maybe ask it of your partner. If your partner today asked you, "Well, what do you do for a living? What does that company do?" How would you describe what that company does? And I think that's pretty telling of you knowing how they're positioned. Now, I don't mean get technical. Your spouse is not going to care how technical you can get, but you should be able to have a conversation when you're out in an event or party or with somebody that could be a potential prospect without being a salesperson. And what you just did is warm someone up to knowing something about your business without being in a sales role. So we can all just be educated on what we do, who we do it for, and who we're not for, I think is even more important. You're starting up a conversation or generating a bit of a lead and you don't even know it.
Who I'm not for, it's okay. We're not for everybody. And you have to be comfortable to say that. And do you know what we tell our sales teams all the time? It's okay to not be the best fit for them.
Absolutely.
And you're okay, because save your time, save their time, and move on, which is great. All right. One last question before because I'm just looking at the time.
Yeah.
We brought it up earlier, and you said those two little letters that make one word that everybody's dominating right now, and it's AI. How have things evolved for you in the messaging, the positioning in this new AI world?
Yeah. I love this. And I love that it's the last question, because we could have probably spent the whole session on it if it was the first question. So what else? If I could leave anybody with a tidbit on it, I would say you're not being replaced by it, but you need to use it appropriately. When it comes to messaging and positioning, stop using it as a tactical agent of, let me go to ChatGPT or Claude and say, help me rework this blog article, or help me come up with copy for my homepage. Like, that's great. That's very task-based AI. Everybody can do that. I feel like, the youngest people in my family could do that, and that's great. I hope everyone learns how to do that in school. Figure out how you can make it an agent. The world of agentic AI is where we need to be leveraging it. From a messaging and positioning standpoint, pressure test. Allow it to be your internal agent where possible. Maybe build something for your marketing and sales teams that allows them to have a real-time conversation about, how do I talk about company X? How do I position company X? What are some lines that I can say to a prospect? What are some things that I can say? How would marketing's positioning guide respond to this? And I think that's the new age of training your team without sitting in person and having them in a boardroom and saying, this is, our positioning session. Build something, use AI, allow it to be your little assistant, but use it in an agentic way, not in a task-based way.
Moving away from using the chatbots as your Google is the most important thing you can do. I totally agree with you. Funny enough, I'll just leave you this little story. I took an AI in go-to-market school with Pavilion, and I loved it. It was so good. It's how I actually figured out how to build my own platform reps and how we've been that. But I've learned a lot from that. But in my cohort, there was somebody who's in RevOps, and the CEO of that company decided to buy some Mac Minis and OpenClaw. And he deployed OpenClaw with full rewrite access to his entire architecture.
Wow.
And so something happened. There's the headers, and the messaging was constantly being rewritten and updated without logic or information, and things were wrong. And the CEO called this revenue operations person and said, what are you doing? This isn't even this is wrong. Who allowed you to do that? And he said, I don't even know what's happening. It's OpenClaw making decisions in real time. But because we don't actually have a history or revision control, I don't even know what you want me to do. Mm-hmm. And he had to effectively unplug it.
Wow.
And start all over again. So the amount of time that was there. Now, there's a great way of pushing and trying to understand all the new technology. But as I think you said earlier on, test and iterate, right?
Yes.
Pick something and see what it is, because the technology now is more advanced than we've ever seen. We're all learning at the same time, and it's not fully fleshed out yet. It's still in beta mode.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, test it. Yes. And don't just test it and forget it. I think that's something that we all end up doing. It's just, well, that's running, we're testing it, I'll revisit it. Mm-hmm. No. We have to monitor it. If you're going to test something, it's the whole saying of, you can't manage what you don't measure. Measure your test so you can manage its effectiveness and success at the end of the day.
I really like it. And I think that's probably the best place that we can maybe move, because again, I told Nima I'd get her out of here in an hour, and I'm almost running out of time. So with everything that we've just talked about, Nima, I like to ask everybody at the end, everybody likes new and nobody likes different. And when you do both at the same time, it either causes friction or uncertainty. So for somebody who's thinking about looking to improve their messaging and their positioning, what are 2 or 3 actionable things on Monday you say, go do these things, and it'll give you a great path forward? What would you tell them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think first, figure out if you do have a messaging or clarity problem. do the thing that we talked about initially. Go ahead and ask 5 people in your organization how they would describe your company, what you do, and who you do it for. I would just say, remember that demand gen doesn't fix your unclear positioning. So if that's what you're focused on, make sure your positioning is strong enough, because demand generation is just going to amplify any kind of challenges you have in there. So start with the 5 people, ask the questions, and then answer the question of, do I have a messaging problem? And then let's get in contact.
Yeah. Awesome. I think that's a fantastic way of saying it. And yeah, there's a lot, and there's more resources now too. Nima, if people, like you said, they get in contact, if people are curious to learn a little bit more, maybe follow you along, like where would you suggest they go?
Yeah, honestly, we're in the era of let's just network, let's just have a conversation. Not everything needs to be an engagement. LinkedIn is the best way. So just reach out on LinkedIn and shoot me a message, and I would be happy to have a chat.
Awesome. If you if you can't tell, Nima and I don't know each other. We had a 30-minute prep call through Gary, and again, super appreciative of Gary. I've had a lot of time to reflect because we spoke a couple weeks ago and think about the conversations of where we want to go. And I'm so appreciative of you doing this and talking about it and bringing it back to, I want to say, the core principles, or the first principles of who are you, what do you solve, and how do you solve it, is sort of how I hear it. And it's, as much as we want to do all the really, really great shiny things, how often do we have to go, you know what, let's go back to basics and fix the basics so that we can do the next new things. And by the way, just because you've grown and you've evolved doesn't mean that your positioning has. Sometimes it's stuck from where you were, and you've got to pull that along to where you are. I've seen that before too, but I think Nima's got a lot more details on that one. And maybe there's another topic here for us to cover in the future, Nima.
Maybe, but this was great, Carl. I'm so appreciative of your time, and I think you nailed it right at the end. And positioning and messaging is just a big deal. So, don't forget about the things that we built our foundation on. Is just where I would leave it.
Amazing. Well, that's going to wrap up another episode of Revenue Problem Solvers. Obviously, want to thank Nima for sharing these incredibly invaluable insights. There are some strategies that you can put into action right away. Remember, success leaves clues, and every revenue problem has a solution. Sometimes you just need the right conversation to find it. Until next time, it's Carl with Revenue Problem Solvers, helping you turn your obstacles into your opportunities. Thank you for investing your time with us today, and we'll see you on the next episode.